Welcome to the Becoming Superhuman podcast, where we interview extraordinary people to bring you the skills and strategies to overcome the impossible. And now, here's your host, Jonathan Levy.
Hello and welcome to the very first edition of the Becoming Superhuman podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Levy. This podcast has been a long time coming. For most of my adult life, I've taken a very keen interest in optimizing and improving my physical health, mental capacities, and my productive life. In 2009, I met someone with an incredible superhuman ability to learn at a dramatically accelerated rate. As the story goes, I went on to train with that individual and his wife, from whom he learned the methodology, and soon became able to absorb and retain information on a whole new level. But it wasn't until about a year or so later when I approached my two private tutors with a proposition to create an online course featuring their teaching methodology that things really got interesting. Fast forward over a year, and our course, Become a SuperLearner, has over 22,000 students from all over the world. Through interacting with these students, I've learned that they, like myself, are eager for skills, tips, and tricks to get more out of their lives, to learn more, to be healthier, and to generally exceed the limits of what is possible. Essentially, it's become clear that a podcast is in order, and this is that podcast. Every week, or close to it, I'll interview someone with a unique approach to expanding human potential. Whether that's physical performance, mental acuity, financial success, or any topic I think you as the listener might find interesting on those bounds. Since this is our very first episode, I thought it fitting to invite the husband and wife team that started it all, Professor Anna and Dr. Lev Goldentouch. Through their combined backgrounds in both psychology and information theory, they've developed a methodology for training what I would later brand as superlearners. Together, the three of us have taught tens of thousands of people all over the world to read, learn, and memorize information at a rate of about 3x. If you're just tuning in and have never seen or heard of our course, this podcast will certainly pique your interest and get you thinking about different ways to enhance your learning and memory. If you have attended the course, you'll find the following to be fascinating: a deep dive into some of the topics that we've covered, and a clarification on some of the things you may have struggled with. And so, without any further ado, I give you Professor Anna and Dr. Lev Goldentouch. So Dr. Lev, Professor Anna, welcome. Thanks so much for making time today. I know you're both very, very busy.
Hi.
Thank you.
And, I'm really excited about today's podcast because our listeners, our students rather, have sent so many great questions. And it's also a really exciting opportunity to share what we teach with a wider audience, far beyond Udemy and our course.
Sure.
So to give some background to our listeners, maybe you guys could share the story of how you both became what we call in the course superlearners, how you became involved in the field, and how did you guys develop this methodology?
I started the SuperLearner process when I was a student in psychology, and I needed to read a lot of researchers, and I found out that I read very slow and I don't remember much except the basic ideas. So I couldn't answer my questions very intelligently enough, in my opinion. So I took the course and I found it very fascinating and a lot related to what I study in cognitive psychology. So I started to teach that. And after I finished my master's degree, I found myself very involved in the field. So I developed my own point of view and I started to formalize a course of mine for making the speed of my reading faster. And beside that, I focused on how do I recall information and how I remember it for the long term. Because sometimes when you're a student, you don't actually read books fluently. You stop and you summarize and you formalize questions and answers. So you don't need the speed. That way I can give those both benefits for my students so I can focus on the speed reading and the memory.
Awesome. So you took a much longer course than the one we teach, which was kind of like 100-something hours.
Yeah.
And at that point, if I'm not mistaken, you and Lev met and you guys got married, and Lev also wanted to learn the methodology, right?
I didn't really want to learn it, but Anna was consistent that I should learn it.
Right.
So she kind of made me take the long course, which was very, very frustrating for me. I was so annoyed by the process that basically I helped Anna develop a different course.
Right. And you were no slouch before, right? This was after your PhD and everything.
Yeah, it was after my PhD.
So you had kind of a background in learning and information theory and that kind of thing. And so you guys kind of condensed the course into what we teach now.
Well, it was originally like 100 hours, then it was 40 hours, then it was 20 hours, and now it's less than 10 hours. So
right.
We're condensing the information further.
Right. And when it's 10 hours, the course that I took, the kind of private one-on-one tutoring, and we've condensed it into 2 hours of lessons and then give people about 8 to 10 hours of homework. So very, very interesting. And it's an amazing story. And I love how you guys both brought your unique backgrounds to kind of creating a methodology that's all your own. And as I tell in the course, I obviously personally benefited a lot from the material when I went to business school. And the amount of interest that was generated just from my colleagues who would watch me read, or people in my study group who would say, are you going to read the case study? Well, I already read it. That's really what led us to creating the course. And the course has been so successful. And I wonder, we've never really talked about it. What do you guys think has made the course successful? Because there's a lot of speed reading and memory courses online. And I'm humbled to say ours is one of the more successful. So what do you guys think it is about our course that made it work?
Well, I think that we do it very, very systematically, and we give all the aspects that connect to people. Originally, we condensed only the stuff that works for almost everyone. So the course has only the exercises that are consistently working for a very large amount of students. Mm-hmm. And students learn from success. When they have success in one exercise and then success in another exercise, this builds up their confidence, and finally they succeed to do something that was very problematic when they started the course.
Right. And it's interesting, like a lot of our students actually comment, and I get a lot of messages on Udemy that, hey, I've taken 2 different speed reading courses and they've never worked, and I'm so excited about your course because nobody has ever explained to me that I need to improve my memory first. I think what's interesting about what Lev said is he talks about, students need to feel success and they need to feel this kind of positive reinforcement. And one of the things we talk about in the course is these 6 different requirements for adults to learn. It's something I don't think a lot of speed reading courses take into account, but we took into account very carefully. As people interested in the learning process, we really thought about what needs to go into the course for people to enjoy it and get that feeling of success. So I would say I agree completely.
I think my process of thinking is, how do I build the steps from the place that I am at to the place that I want to be? So when I describe a person, after you do this exercise, you should be able to do that. And when you see the benefits of this process, you almost can bear anything. So sometimes the exercises are very frustrating and difficult and maybe require more practice for some and others not. But when they see the picture, not the general picture, but for each step, I think they more convinced to do the work.
Right.
I put more attention on fun, and I have written some exercises on key to studies that are different from what you can usually find, and they are very fun to work with.
Right.
So it's not just mechanically studying and doing this tedious work, but actually enjoying what you're doing.
Right. And the process of self-directed learning and choosing that you're going to try this exercise and you're going to do this. It's not like a lot of maybe say university or high school courses where we tell you exactly what you need to do. We say, hey, you should maybe check out this YouTube video. You should maybe check out these exercises. Use your judgment. It's like we give the student a sense of agency and a sense of responsibility in their own learning.
We give very systematic and maybe a little bit obsessive discussion and support to anyone with any kind of question. As I said, most of the exercises work most of the time, which means that 1% of the time an exercise will fail. And then the student can come to me and I will offer an alternative. And for each exercise, we have like 5 alternatives.
Right. Which actually raises a question. I was talking to Anthony Metivier, who's kind of a memory expert as well, and he reminded me of this quote, something learned and then taught is something twice learned. Have you guys learned in the last year and improved the methodology? I mean, this is more students, obviously, than any of us ever expected to encounter with. So the law of large numbers and that kind of thing takes place here. So have you guys, in your own methodology, kind of learned from the students?
Yes. Of course, all the time. Each lesson make me to think differently and to offer different exercises and explanations and techniques. Mm-hmm. I do believe in the core of the course, but I do look for new things all the time.
Right.
Some of our students are extremely talented and they kind of challenge my understanding of what is humanly possible.
Really?
So occasionally I kind of wonder, is it really like that, or the student is kind of joking?
Playing with you.
Yeah, there is this girl that reads as fast as I do, but she doesn't actually understand what she reads. And then after she finished reading, she kind of reads again from her mind. And this
so
is
it's photographic memory.
This is
What?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Exactly. And we have lots of such students with different skills, which are kind of breathtaking.
And I guess that's the beauty. And to Lev's credit, he's done such a good job. And I think one of the reasons our course is so successful is a question doesn't go like more than 12 hours without being answered and answered in an insightful way. And I think we'd be lost without that, to be honest. I think that's such a huge value.
I'm flattered. Thank you.
So Anna said something interesting, which is, that she believes in the core principles. And I think that's interesting because the core principles of our course really have been around for thousands of years. This idea of creating visual representations of your memories. This goes back to the Greeks and potentially even before them, right? There's some thinking in kind of Buddhist ideology about creating visualizations, things like that. So really, would you guys agree? Right, exactly. So would you guys agree that what we call in the course markers, or these visual representations for every piece of information, creating symbols, Lev likes to talk about these animated symbols of, you slipping in the grocery store carrying 10 different items. Those items fall on your head in a certain order. We call that a marker in the course. And I would say that that's really the core of the course. That everything is built on top of that idea. Would you guys say that's fair?
Yeah.
This is a beginning. At some point, this just disappears because you kind of process it without imagining it even. Mm-hmm. So you do not have these images anymore. You just know that the process that created your understanding is the same process that used to create these images when you just started.
Definitely. It definitely becomes subconscious. And actually, last night, I was sitting to dinner with a friend and he's taking our course, which is really funny. So he wanted to tell me 3 to 5 goals that he wrote down. We obviously have everyone write down 5 goals. And so he told them to me, and then somewhere along in the conversation a few minutes later, he forgot them. And he said, I forget what the last one was. And I told him in order what they were. And he goes, how the hell did you do that? I said, well, I have a symbol for each one. And I hadn't even considered that I was creating these symbols. And he goes, well, I told you I want to learn Portuguese. I said, yeah, well, I pictured your face on a map in Brazil. It just happened. Yeah. There was no kind of processing. So it was his face on a map in Portuguese, him looking at technical manuals because he wanted to improve his ability to read technical manuals at work, so on and so forth. So it becomes this amazing second nature thing. But I know you guys also create markers differently between yourselves, and it's a very individual thing. I create them very differently. And I remember one time we were all sitting over coffee discussing the course and everything, and all 3 of us found different markers. So give me some thinking. I obviously teach it one way, but give me some thinking on how you guys choose markers. Say I'm reading an article on TechCrunch. What do you look for, and would a good marker be for you guys?
I would do some kind of pre-reading. Depends on how deeper I want to go with my memory of details from the article. And I would set up a goal for the article. Then when I read, I found the details that would support this goal. So actually, I don't need the main ideas because I get it from the details. But that way I have more specific details, the details that I didn't know, that I can add to my knowledge and build up this understanding. And that way, if I will remember them with my markers, I would be able to support my essay with an intelligent answer. And I will feel like I understood what I read, but also have more details that are specific to what I read.
So in the pre-reading, which is kind of another thing we talk about, you're really deciding actually what kind of markers you want to make. So we're generating interest, we're kind of pre-reading and getting a map of what's in the text, but we're also saying, am I reading this to be able to recite it as poetry, or am I reading this because I'm looking for a specific piece of information, which often, if you're writing an essay, you're really looking for that one quote or that one summarization. Yeah. Interesting.
My approach is a little bit different. Before I start reading from the title, I understand which network of understanding I should load. I kind of load different ideas that I have that are similar to what I am going to read. From that point on, I build upon the knowledge base that I already have.
Of course, yeah.
Now, once I finished reading, I take a minute or several seconds and I analyze back everything that I read and I add it to the network in the most full and complete way that I can find. This way I do not have to reread it, I do not have to recall the article. I basically analyze it to death to the point that I do not need it anymore, and it is a part of my knowledge base.
So you said you have these kinds of different categories that you load up. I forget what...
It's like a dictionary of different ideas, and I kind of load it per subject that I read.
So give us some examples of what those different ideas or kind of categories would look like. Is it like, this is a technical document, I'm going to add it to my understanding of technical knowledge?
No, it's very, very detailed and accurate. It's like pushing a button on the internet and loading a dictionary into a parser. It lasts like 100 of milliseconds or something like that. It's very, very fast, and I actually feel like a click in my head. And from that point on, I read differently.
So I'm reading European history from the 1600s to the 1650s mode.
Stop. Now I am loading the Renaissance. I'm loading Leonardo da Vinci. I'm loading everything that is connected. I'm loading the same period in Japanese history and Japanese Renaissance because it is connected by the ideas that are similar. I'm loading the Roman understanding of mechanics. I'm loading the Greek philosophers that developed engineering that is not yet known. I'm loading a little bit of art just for fun. I'm loading Machiavelli and everything that is connected to it. And it takes like 10 milliseconds. Continue, please.
Wow. So, and wow, that kind of takes my breath away. So the idea behind doing that is now when you're pre-reading, you're just adding these markers in to all the stuff that's already there.
Yes.
So Leonardo da Vinci, Renaissance, Greek philosophers, Japanese Renaissance, so on and so forth. As you were speaking, I actually came up with an image of every single one for those, right? That's very incredible.
My thinking is more technical because I don't have such background. So I would take all of my knowledge of how would I build an article that would have a sense, that would have a purpose. So I use this technical knowledge of how to write down because I wrote a couple of essays and theses. So this is the knowledge that I more connect to.
Interesting. So would you guys say that the differences in how you approach the process and the markers comes from kind of your natural aptitudes, or it comes from, Lev is trained in very technical subjects, electrical engineering and so on. You're trained in psychology and so on. Would you say I'm obviously
This is
originally...
my perspective, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm a researcher. Anna is a teacher. She addresses subjects the way that she would teach them to anyone. I address them as my own personal research. So it's a very different approach.
Interesting. So I guess the takeaway there is kind of to use... Actually, another interesting thing Anthony said, a quote from our interview, and we were talking, and as you guys know, he teaches similar ideas. He says... There are no systems. There are general principles and practices that allow you to create your own systems. Would you guys say that that's true?
It's like you take a known principle and you try to personalize it. And with each iteration, you take it further and further away from the original principle.
Right.
But then after a while, you kind of understand that you still work with the same principle and you come from your understanding back to the original principle. Once you close the loop 2 or 3 times, you kind of understand the idea.
So it's a matter of using the training wheels exactly like we say, create this many markers, review them after this many paragraphs, spend this much time, but then after time you make it your own.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's not a fixed system. It's kind of, and often that's what we're replying when people are asking questions. We're saying, look, in the beginning, you make 3 to 5 markers a paragraph, but in the end, adapt it to the text, adapt it to your own approach to the methodology. What kind of information is more interesting to you? What are you trained in? That kind of thing.
Sometimes in the process of visualization, which is the first step, I analyze with the people what are their advantage, what are they trained to do.
Right.
And I try to convince them not to use the natural visualization. So let's say to you coconut, and you would imagine something brown in your hands. If you are more personal, if you use your personal memories, so don't go to the natural tendency to visualize something. Use your own advantage because you are more personal. Find something that relates to that in your personal memories. And when you more focused on that, to use it not automatically, but to think about how do I use it in my thinking process, I think that would give you advantage that we talked about earlier.
Right. And it sounds like that's exactly what Lev was doing, is taking this previous knowledge.
I'm also doing something a little bit different, which is taking small breaks after each article that I read, after each section, and doing something completely different. This takes me off this mechanical handling of information and allows me to be more creative, both in my approach and my understanding. Also, it reduces the pressure on my eyes and my mind. This way I can consume much more information. In fact, my friends joke that I do not work almost. I drink coffee most of the time because...
I noticed that when we were working in the VC office together. It's like you do these sprints and then, you'll kind of mingle around, see what everyone's doing, and then come back and do these quick sprints.
The basic idea is that I can stay very focused for a very short period of times, or I can make them longer in a fashion of flow, but then there are prices that I have to pay for it. So I need to be very careful which of the times I'm going short sprints and which of the times I'm just going into the flow state. Because after the flow state, you're kind of tired, you need better diet, you need more exercise. And this is something that you sometimes cannot get.
So one question I have, you guys have obviously had these skill sets much longer than I have, which means you've accumulated a lot of information over the years. I know, Lev, you try to read 100 or so articles a day.
Yeah, I still do. Probably I read more.
Right. And of course, and I'm sure you're keeping very up to date and everything like that with a lot of different news. And so one of the big questions that I raise and that I've started dealing with 3-4 years on, where do you guys store all this information? How are you keeping years and years and years worth of accelerated learning, in the forefront of your brain and accessible?
Well, it's like many interconnected networks, which I can divide into clusters. And each time I need to load the information before I read something, I cannot actually load everything to my working memory. I load only the anchor points of some of the more important clusters for the current articles that I'm reading. The brain is very big and it is very good at compressing information. But to access the information, we need to use some methods of acceleration.
And linking, of course.
Acceleration is like caching. It's something which we do not learn before we are like 3 years in SuperLearning. You do not have to accelerate before that because you just do not have enough. Your brain has enough bandwidth to load everything up to 3 years of SuperLearning. At that point, you get to the new point where you just need to load only the stuff that you can work with.
Interesting. Anna?
think that all these processes happen to me parallel to my personal life, which is having babies. And it's, having its own price. But I do believe in my mapping system. So when I read something and I really focus on that, and I pay attention to my markers, to my specific detailed markers, I do believe it's work like a train, like process of remembering jokes. I wouldn't be able to tell you all the jokes that I know, but each time any word or any situation would remind it to me. So I trust this process and it works for me.
Right. Interesting. So, Dr. Lev, I know you're not a huge advocate of the memory palace technique. I think you've developed your own methodology above and beyond the memory palace.
It's very much like memory palace, but with 2 or 3 elements added above it. And I basically cannot use memory palace without it.
Interesting. So for those who don't know about the memory palace, you can listen to the episode with Anthony Metivier, or we can just give you a brief idea of what it is. So this idea that you use physical locations, for example, your home or your office, you clear everything out of the shelves, you clear everything off the tables, you create specific locations, and then you take these markers or these visual images and you say, okay, my knowledge of what the Russian word for open goes on this cabinet in my house that doesn't open properly. It sits right there. I have a symbol, I have an image. And so you can walk through your home and you have all these symbols and images. What Dr. Lev is saying is that he uses kind of an architecture that he's built on top of that kind of 2,000, 3,000-year-old methodology, which I'm very curious to explore how it works.
Well, first of all, if this is a shelf in my house, probably I will not remember it because I cannot find anything in my home.
I feel like that happens when you get married. Things kind of move and get organized in a way that you maybe don't understand.
So I kind of need to approach it more actively. I kind of take a material and morph it into a shelf that I would prefer. But before I can even start morphing, I kind of imagine an environment in which I want to put the whole setup. It can be like a video game. So it's you take some sort of Star Wars or Lord of the Rings or whatever scenario, and you start building the stuff into the Bilbo's home or whatever.
So you have a landscape, imaginary landscape in a sense, and you're mapping information to that.
Information into that. I'm not mapping. I'm actually creating the landscape. I'm morphing information. I'm creating the landscape. I build this universe. And I also build the active personages in the stories that move and access information so that it is not passive, it is active.
That's very clever. So you don't actually have to. One of the things a lot of memory athletes do is they'll spend a week, they'll go to a new city and they'll walk through every museum they can find, every building, apartment, hotel they can get access to because they need to build a library.
I play video games.
I love it. I love how you've kind of taken it to your own because it uses the same principles and the same evolutionary advantage, which is the human brain is really good at knowing location. We're really good at remembering where that watering hole was, but you've adapted it to kind of a modern approach.
I edit NPCs, for example. When you have some kind of recurrent principles, it's like an NPC that you meet in different places, like a guide that goes with you.
An NPC?
Non-player character.
Non-player character. Okay. Got it.
It's like a guide that goes with you, like your own R2-D2 that goes after you. And each time you have a question, you kind of ask him, and you kind of ask him at the same places. So at each point that I want to get some kind of perspective, I kind of ask my own R2-D2, please tell me what is this? And he says, well, this is that interface that works like that. USB 3.1 is 29% better than USB 3.0.
Anna, do you ever walk in the room and see Lev with his eyes closed with maybe like a finger on his temple interacting with his inner R2-D2 memory palace guide?
No, I think he looks like a very important person. So you get deeper into his thoughts and he looks like, okay, don't bother me.
That's super interesting.
Yeah, but it can take hours,
Yeah. Oh, it's certainly a huge investment. Although I was sitting the other day at the DMV waiting in line for about an hour and a half, and I decided I'm going to take all these Russian words that I've learned, which is about 800 of them, and I'm just going to start putting them places. So I sat there and I cleared out all the shelves in my home back in California, and I started placing things. And I've noticed a huge improvement. So I can only imagine with kind of a next level methodology, it helps you store 10 years worth of super learning information.
It's kind of like Google. I try to back engineer some of the Google's methods and to apply them to my own mind. Sometimes it works.
Mm-hmm. So, that brings up another kind of interesting idea, which is in the course we deal a lot with the idea of compression versus speed. And of course, it's pretty logical that there's a trade-off between very high speeds of reading and actual understanding and comprehension. What originally excited me when I met Lev was that his comprehension actually increased above the standard comprehension. So I was reading 450 words a minute when he tested me in my office at about 20 to 30% comprehension. And he was reading above 1,000 words a minute at 80 to 90% comprehension. So in effect, by learning the methodology, I wasn't really giving up anything. I was kind of gaining both speed and comprehension. But we've talked about in the past that speed readers, or the best speed readers, they vary their speeds and they adapt to different densities of material and to the text itself. So I'm interested to hear you guys talk a little bit about that. And, with your extremely high top speeds, how do you approach the decision of how fast to read certain material? Do you do it on the fly? Do you base it on, wait, I'm not really getting as much as I want here? How does that work?
This is advanced course material. We do not teach it in our basic course.
Right.
Our students need to read 1,000 words per minute with 80% understanding before we even try to approach the question.
Wow. So it's for the really, really die-hard people.
Yes, because otherwise you have too many temptations not to work that hard and you will not get to your potential.
Right, which I think is what happened to me. At some point I decided I'm at about 800 words a minute and I said to myself, well, I could learn this or I could learn, I'm working on learning Russian. I'm learning obviously how to podcast. I'm learning how to write Kindle books and stuff like that. And it's just, I guess my question is, for the average person working, not as a researcher, not through a PhD program, but, working in sales or working at a startup or a doctor or whatever it may be, do you think that there's a huge level of benefit for going above the 1,000 words a minute, or it's a very specialized skill for a specific kind of person?
I think that it is good for everyone because we are living in constantly changing environment. And there are many tests that anyone should and will go in order to just live their life.
Right.
I had one student from Brazil and he says that he has to go through a very hard government test just to manage some kind of department store.
Wow.
And that was the reason why he was going to take our course and to pay for one-on-one with Anna. So it's something which is very important for everyone because at some point in our life we will face a next level exam or the next level paradigm shift in our technology and we will need to adapt.
Right. That's true. Or, hopefully we'll get to a point where we can use radio waves to implant knowledge into our brains. Kind of like the Matrix.
To develop our brains, it could help to...
Or the robots will harvest us for coprocessors.
Yeah. So how much work would it take for me to get from my 800 words a minute to somewhere like where Lev is, 1,200 words a minute? Are we talking 100-hour, 20 hours of kind of...
No, it's like I read 2,000 words per minute at 80% retention.
Wow.
So it's a bit of work.
It's a lot of work.
It's kilometers.
Yeah.
If you read hundreds of articles per day, you will get there.
Right.
The World Championship is about 60% retention at about 5,000 words per minute.
Yeah.
My God. At that point, you're talking about people who their life is speed reading.
Yeah.
This is kind of like the memory athletes who train 8 hours a day.
This is competitive sport. There are people who are kind of genetically different and then they train a lot.
That's true, right? So an interesting thing I heard recently, completely tangent, but they're saying that in the Olympics today, what you're dealing with, and at that level of competition, you're dealing with people exactly like you said, who are genetic mutants, right? Michael Phelps's arms are 2 or 3 centimeters longer than they should be for his height. And, at the level that the Olympics have gone to, you're dealing with people who are naturally gifted on top of a superhuman work ethic. I think that's both discouraging and also very interesting.
The good thing is that everyone is a little bit different in something, so probably everyone will be good at something a little bit different. So probably I cannot be a very good speed reader or memory athlete, but I'm a very good researcher.
Interesting. It's interesting to hear me say that you're not a good speed reader when you read 2.5 times faster than I do. But I think my problem is I always am looking at this cost benefit.
I'm not at the world championship level. I'm well below it.
Right. So an interesting thing that I like about Tim Ferriss has this one quote that he says, like, you don't go to the most gifted, most talented people in the world because they can't teach you, because they're freaks of nature and they're gifted. And, Michael Phelps couldn't teach you how to swim, but you go to the guy whose body is disproportionate and spent, 3 years in a wheelchair, and that guy can teach you how to swim because he's had to overcome these hurdles. And so perhaps the fact that Anna struggled with dyslexia is perhaps why she's so effective as a teacher, because you shouldn't be able to read, on the quote unquote normal realm, you shouldn't be able to read nearly as fast as you do. And yet we teach tens of thousands of people how to speed read. Yeah. I think there's something to be had there. There's a point to be made there. Definitely. So one of the projects that Dr. Lev and I are working on, and I'm intentionally announcing this because I want our listeners to hold us accountable to getting it done in the next few months, is a language learning course. And that leads me to an important point, which is I think that our course is successful because we deliver on the promise that students can learn anything more successfully, whether that's history or languages or playing a musical instrument. I think that people come to Udemy and I think they see these 20,000 courses. And at least in my experience, there were hundreds that I wanted to take, and I added them all to my wish list. And I think the average person who's not trained in accelerated learning looks at that and goes, how the hell am I going to learn all of this? How can I soak up all this information? And at that point, hopefully they find our course and they decide to take our course first, which helps them to learn everything they want to learn so much faster. So maybe it would be cool to give our listeners some tips that they can apply to some of the other hot subjects that people are trying to learn right now. And I know that on Udemy, the most popular subject that people are trying to learn right now is programming. And we're very fortunate that Dr. Lev knows about 8 programming languages, if I'm not mistaken.
I have no idea how many. I stopped counting. After I reached 20, I stopped counting.
So 20 different programming languages. How have you applied? Obviously, you learned some of them before.
Basically, it's the same template all over again with a little bit different syntaxes. So you do not actually have to learn anything but syntaxes. You do forget syntaxes, but that's something that is really very easy to learn.
Right.
So you basically store a lot of different templates of how the things are done. And then you just load the template and put some kind of syntaxes above it. And that's it.
Interesting. So let's say you were to go learn a newer programming language like AngularJS or Swift or something. You would look at how is this syntax different? And then you would store just those differences above the existing templates? Basically,
the languages develop like a human being or anything biological. They mutate one from another. So basically, I think that every programmer should know C and design patterns in C. Once a person knows functional C and design patterns in functional C, everything else is just mutated from there. So you kind of trace the biological tree of mutations.
Interesting.
And then you get it.
And I think that's really interesting because what we talk about in our course is that you need to link everything to existing knowledge. And that's exactly what Lev's saying is you probably learned C, one of the first languages.
I started with BASIC because it's really simple. It's for kids. Then I learned C. Then I learned C++. When I learned BASIC, I was 14 years old.
Right.
I just came to Israel and this was the first time that I saw a computer. So I said, okay, what can it do? Well, I could play games in it. Okay, cool. Now I want to program one.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And at that time, they didn't have these easy programming languages. I mean, today, people can learn Ruby on Rails in 1 month and they can build their own applications. But back then, it was a pretty big challenge to learn programming languages, I imagine.
It was very simple. I just learned BASIC. BASIC was a language for kids. It was like built for kids to learn computers. So once I learned basic, it was really easy to apply the same principles to every other language.
Right, like object-oriented and all that kind of stuff.
This is new ideas that needed to add. It took me some time to add the object-oriented ideas because they're a little bit different. The philosophy behind them is a little bit different. So I actually had to build a new dictionary for all the ideas of polymorphism and virtual objects. I just had to develop new templates to store this information within. But once I could do C++, I could do Java, and I could do, pretty much everything.
Very cool. Another thing that I think, like, if you remember, I was trying to learn Ruby on Rails before we built the course. I was kind of deciding, what am I going to do? Am I going to build this course? Am I going to maybe start working on web apps? And I tried to learn Rails. And even with the SuperLearner methodology, I still understand how it works. And I can throw around these terms like object-oriented programming, and I understand the syntax, but I really just don't enjoy it. And at some point, I thought to myself, think of what Anna told me. It's like, you have to use a different methodology, but you also have to figure out a way to make the information fun and engaging for you. There's no way you're going to learn something if you haven't figured out a way to make it applicable. And to me, I said, I know so many great programmers all over the world. I know Lev, I know my friend Yuri, and I couldn't convince myself that it was important for me to learn programming. Especially after finishing an MBA, I would sit there and I'd say, why am I doing this? And I failed because I couldn't take that first step of, why am I learning this? It was just, everyone's learning to program. I should learn to program. I think that's an interesting thing.
I never learn something if I don't have an accurate project where I can actually apply the skills and build something which is creative.
Exactly.
So I would never go and just learn stuff on Udemy because this is cool. I would first kind of develop a skeleton of a new project that is really, really exciting.
Right.
And then I will see what skills I am lacking, and I will learn just the specific skills that I am lacking.
Right. It's funny you say that, because that's exactly how this podcasting thing happened. I decided, wouldn't it be really, really cool to sit and pick Lev and Anna's brain? Wouldn't it be really cool to reach these really interesting movement experts who are kind of at the forefront of kinesiology? And I got really excited, and I said, how am I going to get access to these people and get an hour of their time? And within a couple days, I downloaded a bunch of courses on Udemy. I opened up 50 tabs in my browser and read everything that I could about podcasting, because I had this pressing need. And I knew how I was going to use it. And it was just a matter of getting through all those courses and all that reading to get to these interesting conversations. And it was very easy to learn.
Good job.
Thank you. So one thing I've noticed in the last year or so, now that speed reading has really become ingrained in my skill set, is I remember that in the first year, I would often kind of lose the skill set for a day or two, especially I wasn't sleeping very much during my MBA. And I would fall into these bad habits. And Lev kind of comforted me at the time, and he said, don't worry, the skill hasn't gone anywhere. It'll come back when the conditions are right. And it did. But I wonder, when you've been speed reading for so many years and you guys are way further ahead than I am, is it still kind of a situation where you fall into bad habits? Do you ever catch yourself reading really slowly?
Yeah, sure, of course. It happens all the time.
Is there any rhyme or reason, or it's just sometimes?
Sometimes it's something that I choose. There are things that shouldn't be speed read. Like, you shouldn't speed read haiku. It just will not work.
Right.
So occasionally I just choose not to speed read and to enjoy what I'm reading in some more aspects. Occasionally I just cannot process information fast enough. Some languages like math are super compressed by themselves. You cannot actually speed read mathematical proof of a very complex theorem. It just will not work.
Right.
So sometimes reading is the hard part, and sometimes reading is the easy part. Understanding what you read is the hard part.
Definitely. And there's 1,000,001 speed reading courses. I always tell people, I'll teach you how to speed read in 10 minutes, but it's going to take, 10 to 20 hours for you to understand what the hell you're reading. There's that Woody Allen quote, like, I took a speed reading course and we read War and Peace, or I think it was War and Peace. It's about Russia. And that was my experience. I came into this having done the Evelyn Wood speed reading program. And I'm sure Lev has some comments on how funny I was trying to sit there in the office and read these articles and claiming that I knew how to speed read, which I think is really funny.
I never talk like this about people. Everyone has his own problems. Surely I have a few. So it's kind of a lot of humility just to understand how up we all are and to live with it.
Fair enough. Have you guys noticed that recently in the Facebook group for the course, one of the coolest things that I've seen is a lot of people, 2 or 3 people have come in and said, I'm starting my kids on this course and I want my kids to grow up like a super learner. I don't want them to suffer through school like I did. I definitely felt the same way. If I have kids, I want to start them on this. But one thing that comes up is you need to be a very proficient reader and you need to have a wealth of content to link your markers to, right? Link to existing knowledge. So do you guys teach your kids this methodology? Can it be taught to kids or how does that work?
Usually I tell to people that our Udemy class applies to ages 13 to 70 because there are different emphasis that needs to be put with younger children or with older adults. It's kind of when the kids are very young, their reading skills are not very well developed, so the emphasis is more on visualization, imagination, creativity, and on productivity, how to make things work. Because when we are older, we kind of know how to make things work. Sometimes we are not very efficient in it, but at least we know how to do it. Younger kids do not know that, so they kind of needs to be developed in this direction.
Interesting. But you guys I imagine you sit with your kids and you work a lot on things that are not taught in school.
Usually I kind of try to make them develop their own visual markers to some information that is not taught until university level.
Right.
Like I can teach 6 years old about Kirchhoff laws by explaining how you see water in the river and how it swirls around and how it goes from above to below and stuff like that. And once I show how I open this faucet in a bathroom, they kind of understand how a transistor works.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's kind of how my dad explained to me how transistors worked when I was a kid and I used to play with electronics. So the idea is that markers as a concept work for everybody.
Yeah.
But speed reading, definitely not until you're very proficient as a reader.
The first step of reading when you acquire the reading process needs to be vocalized.
Right.
But by the step that you know and remember all the symbols in your language, you should be able to read words as a whole.
Yeah.
So in this game that I do with my children, I just make cards of words or 2 words. So I make them read in a subvocal process. So even at the age of 1st grade, I can ask my son to read without subvocalization and explain it to me. Other children taught to read out loud at least at 3rd grade.
Right.
Because we want to teach them to pronounce right. Otherwise, how we would know
and
when you read for yourself that you read it correctly.
Right.
But I do it as an exercise. Now you read it very nice for me out loud, and now you read for understanding.
Yeah.
So I do give them the right habits to be able to build it from the first earlier stages.
Interesting.
I work a lot with them with foreign languages, like certain different languages, and we go between the languages. And we work on this word, means actually this, but sounds like this in that other language.
Yeah.
And this is very fun. It's like always funny. The connections are really unexpected and it generates a lot of interest to different cultures, different languages.
Yes, that was one of the breaking points for me in learning languages is I now have a library of 3 languages. And if I want to learn a new word, there's a 99% chance that I have some sound in my library of sounds that I can connect it to in one of those 3 languages. So it becomes very easy to learn. And sometimes I'll mix within one word. Like the first half of the word sounds like something in Hebrew and the second half sounds like something in Spanish. And together, that's what they mean. So that's a really powerful thing as well. Do you guys think that there's potential in building a course either for senior citizens or for children?
For senior citizens, the actual emphasis is a little bit different. It's like not forgetting what you know.
Yeah.
When we teach about markers, we teach kind of how to build this network of markers. But once you are focused on not forgetting them, you need to make this network stronger. I built something that I call anchors, which are super strong markers that are used to upload the whole networks. These anchor markers are a little bit different from regular markers. They are more lively, they usually are more creative. When I build regular markers, I say that can be either logical or creative. The anchor markers are always more creative. They focus my attention on the specific network of ideas. And they are always more active, like you do not put your keys somewhere. The keys appear there for a reason. You put them there so that something will happen.
So that the key demon doesn't find them.
Yeah, something like that.
Right.
It's always more active. And when you are focused on not forgetting something, when you are focused on 100% retention, the anchor markers become very important. They are not that important for speed reading.
In senior citizens, you should invest more because the brain is less active. So this approach would require them to be more
active about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Focused on that.
Right.
And that would be enough.
Right. They say one thing that I found interesting, and I now have my father studying 2 languages, because they say that learning a language or something very complex actually can fight off, they haven't proven it yet, but can fight off Alzheimer's and like mental deterioration, dementia, stuff like that. And a lot of the elderly suffer from this because they're doing a lot of passive. They're watching a lot of TV, they're playing a lot of bingo, not creating these new neural networks, not creating new synapses, stuff like that. And obviously your brain's going to deteriorate, you know?
This is an issue that is called neuroplasticity. Our brain always changes and adapts to new stimulus.
Right.
Once we stop getting new stimulus, our brain will deteriorate very fast.
Right.
So even if we suffer temporary deterioration, by exposing ourselves to new stimulus, we can develop the neural networks back.
Exactly. And any kind of new stimulus, new places, new foods lead to an increase in neuropinephrine, which puts the brain in a hyper-aware state and creates learning.
This is localized.
Right.
Neuroplasticity is localized. So if you want to develop some sort of area, it is important that the new stimulus is somehow related to the area that you want to develop.
Right. Yeah.
So you kind of need to go out of your comfort zone in many different areas. You need to be more adventurous.
Definitely. That explains why a lot of these memory athletes will fly to a new city that they've never visited to build new memory palaces, for example. Or, I had someone who told me that if I'm trying to learn about new cultures, I need to try the foods. Because now I'm thinking in this cultural context, maybe in a more culinary context, but I'm thinking in this cultural context of, why would the Thai people make food so spicy? Well, it's very hot. And well, in their history, they were dealing with rancid meat and things like that. And it gets me thinking in that vein, which helps me understand their culture a little bit better, for example.
It's much easier from a historical viewpoint. Once you have the whole history, it's very easy to focus on specific aspect of history. I have a huge network which is very similar to the TV's Big History show, where I kind of store all these historical facts, and then I kind of zoom in either on an area or on period or on phenomena. And it is just cutting the network in different ways, projecting them on different aspects.
Interesting. Do you guys listen to podcasts at all? I've recently really started enjoying podcasts because it's
so slow.
Yeah. So I have to use the podcast app on the iPhone, which is it goes up to 2x speed, and then things are kind of manageable. But I like it because I can do a physical activity, and physical activity is another one of those things that puts the brain in a learning state and raises endorphins, stuff like that. So I can do physical activity and I can listen to a podcast, and my retention's pretty high considering auditory information is of less quality than visual, but I've found it really, really interesting. It's a great way to consume more content, expose myself.
It's a little bit different method of visualizing why you listen to stuff, and it has to be taught separately. I actually have several articles about it on Keto Study.
Oh, great.
Of how to remember conversations and stuff like that.
Yeah.
This is something that needs to be learned separately from reading books because you don't have structure.
Yeah.
Right.
When you look at book, you have a very concrete structure.
And you can't pre-read a conversation. Unfortunately. What are you going to talk about in the next 5 minutes? Can you give me an idea? Yeah, definitely. So those are already on Keto Study, and we can link to them in the show notes.
Well, at least some.
Some. I know you're always adding when you guys have time. But that's interesting. And I think we could talk for an hour just about that, because so many people today are consuming information by video, TED Talks, Udemy courses, obviously. So there's a lot of interesting stuff to be said there as well.
Yeah, we would love to have another podcast, and we would love our listeners to vote on what subjects are more interesting for them.
Definitely. I think it's highly likely that we do this every couple months. We sit down and we kind of review, because look, when it comes to superhuman skills, I think one of the most important ones, if you want to learn other ones, is learning, right? And I remember Lev and I sitting kind of in the cafe, or the cafeteria rather, at the VC office, and talking about all these superhuman skills. I know Lev studied meditation for a long time and has studied all kinds of different things. I personally study physical fitness very extensively, but none of that's possible if you're not the kind of person who can learn an entire field of study in a week.
It takes usually a little bit more than a week. Even for me now, it takes about 3 months to learn something.
Sure. Actually, that's a really good question. What are you guys learning right now?
I'm actually building some kind of investment philosophy with everything about it. It's built on my PhD in financial math and stuff like that. So it's really cool. I'm building another website around it, a set of PHP tools for analysis, mathematical theory around it. It's very cool.
That is very cool. So you're doing a lot of learning in kind of algorithms and things like that.
More like trading and various types of assets, modern portfolio management, stuff like that.
That's very cool. That's very, very cool, and super, super technical, super complicated stuff from what I remember.
It's very easy for me.
Really?
Very easy. Very, very easy.
So what else? What's challenging you?
I do not actually do something that is challenging. I build it up step by step. So when I get to it, it's easy. If I see something and it's too challenging, I just give up because it's not worth it.
Right. So breaking things down into manageable chunks.
Yes.
Yeah. I think that's smart. I think that's also what I've kind of done with languages and with the podcasting and all that stuff is, first, let me just learn this one element. Once I get, it's actually exactly what you talked about in the beginning of the podcast. Like once I feel that experience of success and I have this one interview that I think has gone really well, now I'm motivated to learn more. How do I edit it? How do I promote it? How do I, remaster the audio? And I have motivation because I have traction, which is cool. So Anna, what are you learning? What are you working on?
I like to see, I'm very invested in what I do. So I like to look at that from different angles. Mm-hmm. And now I'm studying for learning disabilities analyzation. Mm-hmm. So I want to understand and be able to explain and to measure these kind of problems that I'm dealing with people. So I would be able to explain them, where is it coming from and how do I recommend to work on that.
Interesting.
I'm taking a step back.
Yeah, a step back into kind of the origin or the genesis of the methodology.
Well, she has a logo that she can take a student from C to A in 5 days, and it always works.
Amazing.
So far, it never failed.
Amazing. From C to an A. Yeah, I was about a C student in 5 days. In 5 days. It sounds like that might be another Udemy course. Amazing. And is that a lot of just training them to use their visual?
No. When I do the analysis, I'm measuring cognitive processes and I need to build a picture that makes sense.
Productivity and creativity, how to get from A to B, from B to C, and how to make all this progress work so that they do not get stuck at each point.
I see.
They kind of get a task and they finish the task because they know how to complete it.
Amazing.
Sometimes it seems like if I add A and B, I would get to C.
Right.
And sometimes I can arrange it differently and I need to be focused on one.
Right.
To find the one that is correct.
Right.
Because I want to build a further training program. So I can't be changing this picture further.
Right.
So I need to focus on something. And it's very hard for me. My downsides is to see the big picture. So I'm very professional in this kind of thinking to make people to see the details. But for me, it's still very hard to see the big picture. So this training is actually an opportunity to do that. I need to see the big picture.
My next question is actually a big picture question, so I apologize. What do you guys think the future of academics are? Because I always look back at the way that I was taught in grade school, high school, college, graduate school. And I think to myself, like, why did I sit there and listen to lectures, which first off aren't as effective as self-directed learning, in my opinion, especially for my learning style. Nobody ever gave me markers. Nobody ever suggested that I build a memory palace. Nobody ever suggested that I chunk information. I was never, ever taught how to pre-read an article. I mean, it just seems almost as if the system was built thousands of years ago. And for some reason, nobody wanted to make it more efficient or effective. And the things that students need, these tools, no one cares to teach in academia. Do you guys think that's going to change?
This is like an accounting process. Once you set different measures, different criteria, it changes the whole process. Mm-hmm. Nobody is willing to set up new set of criteria because it is very hard. And what you do with those people who learn with an old set of criteria?
People who do succeed under the kind of traditional academic methodology.
Yeah, it's very hard to have several competing methods. For example, the founders of Google and the other very successful people, they learned under different systems and under different rules, and they are very successful. But not everybody that went through these different systems, they are more successful than those that went through the traditional systems.
When you say different systems, you're alluding to the fact that kind of in Soviet countries, they had a different learning methodology?
No. There are different methodologies like Montefiore method, like it is like...
Montessori, you
Montessori.
mean? Yeah.
Montessori is like 100 and something years old.
Right.
120 years old. So it's not very new. It works differently.
Right.
And some people are very successful because of it, and some people are not successful because of it. So it's not...
What's that methodology that Sergey and Larry from Google...
Montessori.
They were Montessori.
Yeah.
Because they made it to the US when they were like 8 or 9 years old, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
You should actually read the biography. It's different.
Yeah. No,
much earlier.
Yeah.
Larry was born in US, from what I remember, and Sergey kind of came to US when he was like 4 years old, and his father was a professor from some kind of St. Petersburg University, something like that. I don't remember it very well.
Interesting.
It's like I read it 10 years ago, so my memory is not very...
And it's not information you probably use.
I think that the future is to give the students the big picture, the templates, the patterns, because you can feel the details with your own learning.
And do you need the details when a Google search is a second away? You know? It's more about understanding the content.
Yeah, exactly. And I think from the master's degree, your studies is less on learning information, but to build your theses. And then the problem is about the same, because you become a very information follower and not a building an idea.
Right. That is interesting. I was recently told about something called High Tech High, which apparently they've just now opened in Israel. But it's this idea that kids come, everything is on the laptop, all the lectures are through the laptop. The teacher sits in the front of the class with a laptop and directs the students to do this. And basically all they're doing is self-directed learning. Like there's obviously some controls on what they're allowed to browse, but it's like, today we're going to learn about European history from the 1600s, and it's their choice if they want to learn about Leonardo da Vinci, or if they want to go into Japanese Renaissance, or if they want to learn about the Renaissance as a whole and all those different things we talked about before, which somehow I still remember because I have markers for them. So I think that's a really interesting concept. And I think that the more successful, it kind of touches on Montessori from what I understand of the method, that it's much more self-directed learning and the children are much more active and have much more agency in what they're learning.
I'm a little bit concerned about the skills that we lose with all these methods. Like, it is very important when I see someone who has a PhD in physics and I kind of start to develop with him a system of optics. There are people who know the formulas well enough to come to the board and just to do everything on the board. And there are those that directly jump to simulations. The good ones are those that can draw the things on the board.
Really?
Yeah.
That's very interesting. So it's more about being a holistic learner than it is about completely losing the skills that, you know.
Yeah.
For example, people always talk about, well, what about these kids at High Tech High? They never use paper. So are they going to have handwriting skills? And I say, who the hell cares, right? Because I think that's a much less relevant skill when you have technology that you can print something out right on the fly, right?
Well, it's very good for very simple technologies, but once you get to really complex stuff, it's good to be able to slow down and think deeper.
Right.
And then it is very good to simplify things. When we work on computers, we can handle very complex information very fast, but we are not taught to simplify things. When you kind of write them down, they need to be really, really simple. So you put much more attention to analysis, and it's very important skill.
It's when we teach the mind map, there are people that find the program and do it in the program.
Yeah.
And then when they need to build it in their mind, they think like a program.
Right.
But for me, pen is always the better choice.
Well, and we all grew up with, I didn't use a computer for academic purposes until I was 14 years old, probably. And even then it was just for typing up papers. So I was never typing notes. Wikipedia didn't exist until I was about that age. So, so very interesting. So you talked about you're working right now on a lot of finance, and we talked a good bit about programming languages, and it sounds that you guys have a methodology for working on highly complex material. I think the method has to be adapted in such a way that if you're reading something that one pass through it isn't going to work. How do you guys do that? How do you work on very technical material?
My approach would be layering the information. The data knowledge is built up in layers. So I would spend time to pre-read something or pre-learn or build a template of the subject that would be more general. So I would know how many details do I need to go deeper and how actually they relate to the main goal of the subject. So let's say we're talking about ethics of philosophy or philosophy of ethics. It depends on how do I look and which details do I need to formalize and learn. Except for studying the details of different philosophers and what was their approach and what their main beliefs are, I would need to formalize the why question, the most global and important questions in our life is the why question. So why those details are connected to the main goal. So, I need to look at the subject several times, maybe night before. I would think about the structure of the information. That way I would have separation between the time that I think about the subject and I study it.
Mm-hmm.
When reading very complex subjects, students often want to speed read and understand everything on the first read. It will not work with many of the items that you need to read. Occasionally you will need to read, put it away, read something else, and then return back with new understanding. Occasionally, the first time that we read something, we do not understand it fully. We get only the technical parts of how it works without getting the full picture.
Mm-hmm.
Building the full picture and the driving forces of what we are looking at is very important for a very good understanding of the complex material.
Right.
So occasionally it is good just to put the article away after a very short reading and get back to it after understand the driving forces of the article.
I see. So kind of let your brain do its back office processing, if you will.
It's a very active process. You go to Wikipedia, you go to Google and search for similar articles. Mm-hmm. You try to read textbooks on similar subjects. You read the articles which are referenced in the articles that you want to read. And only when you are ready, you get back to the articles that you want to read.
I see. Interesting.
You build your background, yeah.
So I think that's all the questions that really I had. There were so many that were submitted, and those were kind of the top ones. What do you guys think is the future of our course? How do you think that this methodology will grow? How will it improve? How will it change with, technology, things like that? I mean, one thing that we got a lot of questions about was that Spritz, right? It's kind of this like speed reading software that they claim will improve your comprehension in speed reading and all that stuff. And, we reviewed in the course and said, look, This is no better than just looking at the page and saying you know what you read in terms of comprehension. But what do you guys think is the future of super learning?
Well, eventually we will be merged with computers one way or another. It's just a question of how and when. So basically, I think that we need to understand computers better and make computers more like us.
Interesting.
Yeah, for me it's a big difference because when I started 10, 12 years ago, it was with the newspapers. And today sometimes I find myself explaining what is a newspaper.
What is a newspaper?
Yeah.
Interesting. So Lev and I were talking before the interview. I know you guys picked up a Kindle recently. I use an iPad. I can't get along with the Kindle because the pages, I can't just scroll. And on the iPad, I use the continuous scroll feature. So I'm just
Kindle,
flying.
I tap. The screen size is just like my visual angle, but the tapping is a little bit slow for me. So the ink is a little bit too slow for me.
Right.
So I ended up reading on my 24-inch screen.
Right. What about Anna? How are you consuming content? On an iPad, on a computer screen?
Usually from my phone.
Really?
Yeah.
So you have the continuous scroll?
Yeah. And I have the column effect. So it has
one column.
Less words per saccade.
She has tennis elbow.
Yeah.
So you don't have to do saccades if you're reading on the phone.
Exactly.
If I remember, and actually women have a wider visual span. From what I've researched, they have better peripheral vision, which I think is interesting.
The peripheral vision is different from the one for the speed read because it's other range, different ranges.
It's a different resolution. It's for movement. It's not for reading.
Interesting.
It's for situational awareness.
Right. That is true. Interesting. Very interesting. So very well. Thank you guys so much for making the time. I'm really excited. I know we're going to add some links to the show notes, to some different articles and different stuff, obviously to our course. For anyone who's listening and hasn't taken the course, we're going to add I think it's an 80% off coupon since we've now teased you with an hour of talking about this course and all these different methodologies. So we'll include that in there. For people who want to get in touch with you guys, want to learn more, maybe want to do private coaching with Anna, how do they get in touch? Do they go to the Key to Study blog? So keytostudy.com, right?
Yeah.
And you guys have your bios up there and different articles that kind of go beyond what our course teach and all that stuff.
Great.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much.
Jonathan. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to the Becoming Superhuman podcast. For more great skills and strategies, or for links to any of the resources mentioned in this episode, visit www.becomingasuperhuman.com/podcast. We'll see you next time.